What's up, guys? Welcome back to class. Okay, so we've kind of wrapped up the war in Europe and going back to kind of the beginning of the unit. Remember when America, after Pearl Harbor, we get sucked into this conflict. Um, we're going to be in a two-front war. We had decided that Nazi Germany posed the bigger threat, so 90% of our resources and manpower went to defeating the Nazis first, 10% out to the Japanese. Now, over the years, that was a decision made in early 1942. Now we're getting into 1945. That's gradually been adjusted as the war is going on. As Nazi Germany was closer and closer to collapsing, and we're getting close to a final victory there, we gradually start diverting more manpower and resources out to the war in the Pacific. Well, of course, once Hitler commits suicide and Nazi Germany is officially done, now basically all of our manpower and resources is going to be dedicated towards fighting and defeating the Japanese. Some big differences, though, between the two, and I've mentioned this a little bit, but the Germans, they had a very evil regime. The Nazis were an evil political group that took over and manipulated that country and made, the German people and German industries do a whole lot of horrific stuff. But culturally, Germany is very similar to America. Just their schooling system, education, culturally, religious wise, just overall mindset and values, they're pretty darn similar to Great Britain, France, the other European cultures. And America definitely has kind of at its base a European or westernized culture. Japan is very, very different from America. So what do I mean by that? Remember, they're an honor culture. Now, when Hitler gave the order for the German army to fight to the last man, and you're going to die, die fighting, resisting the Allied invaders, the vast majority of German soldiers, once it kind of, they did their duty, but once it became hopeless, they surrender. They're not going to follow that order. The Japanese are totally opposite there. They look at this as an honor type thing, and that if the emperor and the high command gives the order that you're going to fight to the death and you're going to give your life to repel the invaders, keep the barbarians out of our islands. And remember, Japan's history goes over 2,000 years, and until the end of World War II, they had never once been conquered by an outside invader. So, from the Japanese mindset, they feel like by 1945, they're not going to win the war. They realize that they've lost. Their empire has collapsed. They're starting to accept that, but they absolutely feel like there is no way we will ever surrender and let these foreign barbarians, these Americans and the British or Russians, set foot on sacred Japanese soil. They are determined to repel that and to make it so that, hey, maybe they've lost their empire, but they're still going to be an independent, country that is under its own home rule. They don't want to be a colony for somebody else or be dominated that way. Most of the Japanese soldiers, the vast majority, were willing to sacrifice and give their lives for that. And if it meant kamikaze planes and banzai charges and these suicide missions, so be it. They were very willing. And this shocks American soldiers. It's a very, very different kind of war in the Pacific theater from the European theater. Also, remember and looking at the map here that I put up for you, you're going to follow my cursor around in a minute. Geographically, it's a very different conflict too. The fighting in Europe is continental ground fighting. The ground we have the D-Day invasion, which is an aquatic invasion, moving an army across the body of water. But once we have a foothold in France, then it's going to be ground fighting from there on out. Very conventional style ground war where our tanks and planes and soldiers are pushing into Germany. Japan in the Pacific theater is totally different because they really have a large ground empire. Theirs is kind of a sea or ocean empire, where essentially their empire is a bunch, hundreds of little islands that they've conquered. So out in the Pacific, it's the Marine Corps that's being used and the American Navy, where we are doing something called island hopping. Now, this is something that I want you to put in your notes that I don't have a bullet point up there, but for those of you that are watching it, I'm giving you a quiz answer right there. I'm giving you also an exam answer. A very important term I want you to put in. This is a bonus one for the people that actually watch these. Put in island hopping. This ties into the Pacific theater of World War II. And essentially what island hopping hopping means, it's pretty much what it sounds like. It's going from where the U.S. Navy is taking one island after another, where we are hopping islands. We're taking islands of strategic importance and we're bypassing other ones. We didn't have to take out every single Japanese island. Essentially, we got to get to Japan. We got to make the empire collapse. And then those other islands, they're going to fall in line and eventually surrender and give up if we take out like the mother country. You know what I'm saying? So again, island hopping, taking islands of strategic importance and then leaving other ones behind, just going around them and bypassing them. Now, by the time you get to 1945, remember all the Japanese ships in the Navy, which at one time, beginning of the war, they had a pretty darn good Navy. We've broke the back of the Japanese Navy. And America's lost a lot of ships too, but the big difference is every time America loses a ship, we have 3 more, 5 more, 10 more ships that are coming off the line. We can replace our losses. When Japan loses a ship, they can't really replace them. So every time we take out a Japanese ship, their Navy just gets smaller and weaker and smaller. So they really can't supply all of the islands and their whole empire at this point in the war. They're just doing what they can to hold on to what they have. Now, this would be back in like basically the beginning of the war, Pearl Harbor, essentially, or right after Pearl Harbor. They gobble up these islands. If you're following my cursor there, that's where the oil was. They try to come down and get into Australia, but are not able to. Here, number 12 right there is Hawaii. This 20 is Midway Island. Remember, that was the first like American victory in the war, where Japan was trying to gobble up Midway Island and then eventually may have tried to take Hawaii. But that was where we initially stopped them, even with a much smaller force out there and only 10% of our resources and manpower. We were able to stop them there. Now, most of our army and resources has been tied up in Europe. Over from late 1942, 43, 44, with the manpower and equipment we have out in the Pacific, we've been slowly, steadily beating them back and pushing them and taking the war to them. The war had turned in our favor, really from the time of like the Battle of Midway on, which is kind of midway through the war, and it's out midway in the Pacific. Basically, every battle from there on out in the Pacific theater was an American victory. But a lot of these battles, even though they're victories for us, they come at a very high price because these Japanese soldiers, when they go into battle, they have the mindset that I'm already dead. It's just, how is my death going to play out? Am I going to die an honorable death or am I going to die a coward's death? So, like, I think really, and we have a hard time getting in their heads because we're so culturally different, but that is the mindset that the average Japanese soldier has. It's rare for any of them to surrender or anything like that. Most of them are very committed to fighting to the last man and trying to take out as many of these American invaders as they can, so to give their death more honor and meaning. Okay, so now where we're picking up, and remember, I skipped 100 battles in the European theater and in the Pacific theater. I already have spent a ton of time on World War II. There's just no way I have the time to cover every single battle. So we have kind of skipped past battles like Tinian, Saipan, Pelelau, where these other little islands, these little specks of dust out in the Pacific Ocean that thousands of American men sacrificed their lives to go recapture and take. Now I'm kind of fast forwarding towards the end of the war, but I do want to hit a couple of the most famous and really kind of bloody battles out in the Pacific theater of World War II. This one, this is just kind of introing in defeating Japan, kind of wrapping up the war in the Pacific. And there's a couple, like 3 kind of mini chunks of notes that I'm going to give to you over the next few days. So here we go. The only slide that I had for you to take notes on today, you should already have defeating Japan in the Pacific theater. You'd have island hopping. And then this is what I'd want you to put another little subheading for. Iwo Jima. You may have heard of that before. It's a Japanese word. It means sulfur island. This is a very, very tiny island that would, just looking at it in a map of the Pacific, you'd think, why are we taking this island? It's a little speck of dust. It's about 2.5 miles wide by about 5 miles long. So think of that, to put it in perspective. This little island out there is smaller than Michigan Center School District. It is tiny, 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 way smaller than the beaches in Normandy that we used for the D-Day invasion, which were spread out over 30 plus miles. All right. So this tiny little island, why the heck are we going to this one? Well, a couple things things that are significant about it. Second bullet point I have here, this is the first time in World War II that American soldiers are landing on Japanese soil. So Iwo Jima was not just some island that Japan had conquered. This was the first island we take that had traditionally been part of the country of Japan. As far as I know, I believe it's still part of the country of Japan today, although not many people live on it. It's super duper tiny. So anyway, Japan is four pretty big islands plus like 1,000 tiny little islands, all right, that are scattered. This is one of the furthest ones away from the big islands. Now, why do we want to get this island? Well, here you go. The third bullet point, the really strategically important thing about Iwo Jima is that it can be used as an air base. Now, the thing is, go back here real quick. We have Hawaii. We have like Guadalcanal, some islands down here. But the thing is, and it might not seem that way on a map, but to do a round trip flight for our bombers to fly all the way to Japan and all the way back, we don't have bombers that are long range enough to do that. A B-17 could probably fly about round trip from, like, follow my cursor here, from Hawaii to Midway and back. But that's kind of like their range. Now, by this point in the war, we've developed better bombers that are much longer range, better bombers than what we used in Europe, like in the movie Memphis Belle, those B-17s. But we still didn't have any islands at this point close enough to do round trips where we could start bombing Japan like we had done to Germany. Once we take Iwo Jima, now we're in close enough that we can set up an air base there after that, and we're going to start bombing the hell out of Japan. And we're going to do the exact same thing that we essentially did to Germany, but probably even more severely, arguably, where we're going to bomb them back to the Stone Age. All right. We're going to target Japanese cities and factories and basically take away their ability to wage war against us. So strategic air base, that's a pretty important thing. Now, for Iwo Jima, I want you to know that is one of the bloodiest battles that America's ever fought in. And I would say probably for the Pacific theater of World War II, it's arguably, now this is a subjective thing, a Toluki opinion, I think it's the most famous battle that America fought in the Pacific theater against Japan in World War II. So very well known. I guess usually most kids have at least heard of it before. Now check out the photo that's above my head here. See that one of the American guys planting the flag? Have you ever seen that image before? Typically, most kids coming into my class, even kids that don't know much about history or World War II, have seen this photo before. I hope you have, and I'm honestly kind of surprised if you'd say, I've never seen anything like that before, because actually that photograph there, the flag planting at Iwo Jima, is the most reprinted photograph in all of human history. How about that? No, it wasn't a staged photo op either. It was actually like, this was after the first couple days of fighting at Iwo Jima. This is the top of the mountain because Iwo Jima is a dormant volcano. So it's not active, but it's essentially like the top of a volcano peeking up out of the ocean. And you just have the little tip of it up there. And that's why it's called Sulphur Island, too. Iwo Jima means Sulphur Island because basically the whole island, I guess, smells like a burnt match head, which they use sulfur in matches. So if you ever smelled that, the whole island's like that because it's all volcanic ash and rock. Now, when you see that photo that was used in all kinds of propaganda, it was run in magazines, it was newspapers. If you go on the Washington, D.C. trip, we're actually going to go to a monument, a massive statue is a recreation of that. You'll see a big statue that looks just like that photograph. Very iconic image. I mean, you look at it and you're just like, what does it make you think? I look at that and I think, man, American teamwork. We did it. We've won the battle. And I think a lot of other people thought that too. That's why it's the most reprinted photograph in world history. But it's a really iconic one and a piece of American history. Now, the thing is, there's a lot of story behind that photo too. It was not a photo op. It was actually like it was on the top of Mount Suribachi, which is the peak of this dormant volcano. Looking at the photo, you'd think the battle's over, we've won. But actually, that wasn't the case. We land in the island. We take most of the strategic positions. We get up to the top of the mountain over a couple days of fighting. But actually, the Japanese soldiers there hold out for almost a month, where we didn't know where they were at in the island. We kind of have an idea what they did, but unlike how Germany had tried to repel the D-Day invasion, where they built pillboxes and had barbed wire, those hedgehogs out there that were set on the beach to repel landing craft. Japan didn't have all the time, money, or resources to do that at Iwo Jima, so they essentially tunneled inside the island. So they used the island, the rock. They tunnel into this volcano, and they're hiding inside the island, which made it really, really tough to find them. And they were able to hold out there for quite a while. So, all of the guys in this photo, I believe there were 6 guys that planted the flag. You'd think like the battle's over. These guys won. They did it. But actually, I think it is 4 or 5 of those guys die in the upcoming days in the fighting that is still going on. Because as we're trying to secure that island and set up our air base there, constantly, Japanese soldiers are popping out of nowhere from these tunnels, from these foxholes they've dug, and most of them are out of ammunition. They can't shoot much anymore, but they pop out of nowhere and stab American guys with bayonets and stuff. So it is horrific, grisly fighting. It's not like the fighting of the European theater that we experienced against the Germans. If this was the German army fighting there and holding it at the end of the war, most likely they would have surrendered and it wouldn't have been nearly as bloody. But basically, I think it was about 25,000, I think it was 25,000 Japanese defenders were entrenched on this island. 216 survived. Think of that. That's a mind-blowing statistic. I mean, usually in most wars and in most battles, if an army loses 10%, that's heavy losses. 20%, 30%, those are like catastrophic. The guys of the Lost Battalion, that movie I showed from World War I, they lost about 50%, a little over 50% of their unit. What is of 25,000, 216 survived? That's like a high 90-some% casualty or death rate, not even just like injured. Most all of these Japanese defenders give their life to try to take out and kill as many Americans as they can. Of those 216 that survived, I mean, a couple of them may have just been guys that didn't buy into honor culture and they're like, screw this, I'm not fighting to the end. But the vast majority of them did buy into the honor culture, and that was a part of them. A lot of those guys that actually we do take as POWs, it was because it would be a situation like a grenade went off next to them, it knocked them unconscious, and we're able to get them and secure them, and they were knocked out when we grabbed them, or injured so badly they couldn't fight to the death. Okay. Anyway, it's horrific fighting, and you can watch. They've made a bunch of movies about this. A lot of them are pretty good. Some of them, not so much. What I'm going to use for you today is this movie, if you're interested in this kind of stuff, and specifically this photograph and the story behind it. There's a movie that came out about 10, 15 years ago called Flags of Our Fathers. And essentially that movie is all about the story of this photograph. But there are a few snippets in the movie that show the actual fighting and the landing at Iwo Jima. I'm only going to show you about a 10-minute excerpt out of the film that just shows the landing and the first day of fighting there. So hopefully you like it. I think it's pretty entertaining. It'll give you a better idea and visual of what I'm talking about when it comes to this battle. Anyway, I think I covered it pretty darn good. But down low here, this is a photo of Iwo Jima today. Oops, sorry. Yeah, no, get the next one. Anyway, that's what it looks like today, but very small island. Up here is the top of that dormant volcano, roughly where my cursor is now. That's where the flag planting photo was taken. So hopefully you like it. You found this interesting. Pretty epic American battle here. And if you like it, if you want to learn more about this, I have a few books and a few other movies that I could recommend to you where you could dig into this more deeply and learn more about it, because it is a pretty cool part of American history in World War II. All right, hopefully you enjoyed that. Now go turn into the movie clip I have, the brief movie clip from Flags of Our Fathers, where you'll get a better visual of an idea of what I'm talking about. Take care.